to talk about scale insects in the next two sections. And this involves several families that are found within the insect order Hemiptera, but there are three primary ones that I'll focus on for this discussion here. Now, first of all, what is a scale insect? It's going to be an insect, again, in the insect order Hemiptera. It has piercing, sucking mouthparts, as do all the insects in that order. And it is a related group of insects to things like mealybugs, aphids, whiteflies. But scale insects will cover themselves, usually with a fairly distinctive scale cover, and we'll talk about what that's made of. So often you do not see the insect itself, you see the covering over the insect, and I hope the pictures coming up will show this. There are two general types of scale insects. There are a few others that are minor groups, but in general, I'd like to discuss these as being either a soft scale or an armored scale. And in this picture, we have a scale insect of the armored scale group, the pine needle scale. On the right is what you would see of the scale cover, and then flipped over on the left, you can see the actual insect within it. So the scale insect, again, is covered and underneath that covering. When we have a soft scale, like a pine tortoise scale indicated here, you can see the scales on the left, and they have one that's flipped over to see it on the right side. So the covering is fairly distinctive for each species, and is what you will observe. The insect itself is underneath that. So again, there's two general types of scale insects, soft and armored, and they have very important distinctions. Armored scales are going to have a covering that completely encloses but is not attached to the body. Furthermore, these will lose their legs and their mobility with that after the first molt, and we'll talk about this. They'll have a period after egg hatch called a crawler, then they settle and lose their legs. So they'll remain immobile for almost their entire life. The covering of the armored scale is primarily made up of proteins along with some waxes. And you will see the scale cover of most armored scales either being kind of an elongate form, like is indicated in the upper picture, or a kind of circular form with a little nipple on it. So those are the two most common forms of armored scales. And these would be examples of a couple kinds of armored scales that occur on trees and shrubs. Two on the upper part are in that elongate form, and the two on the lower part are more of the rounded form for the scale cover. Soft scales, the covering is attached to the body. The underside is not covered, however, and they retain their legs and mobility after the crawler stage. So you're going to see more mobility when we're talking about a soft scale, moving to different parts of the plant often. The covering is made up of waxes. And the body forms tend to be kind of elongate oval, more rounded as they mature and swell with eggs. So these would be some examples of some some soft scales. The ones on the left are fairly typical. The one on the upper right is actually a soft scale of another family, Areococcidae. We sometimes call them the felt scales. And the one on the lower right, the cottony maple scale, is one that produces an enormous sac of eggs in the waxy, cottony-looking egg sac. And we'll show some pictures of these in more detail. Again, scale insects have piercing, sucking mouthparts, as do all insects in that order Hemiptera, to which they belong. And when you have piercing, sucking mouthparts, you have some sort of stylet, and these are pictures from aphids we've shown you earlier, but they've some sort of stylet that will penetrate into the plant, and they will remove the fluid through a food canal, and they'll have a parallel salivary canal. Now, the way scales feed varies by type. Soft scales feed on the fluids of a phloem. So in the case of a soft scale, they are going to be similar in the way that they access the food that they get in the same manner as do aphids, whiteflies, and mealybugs, the other phloem-feeding members of the order Hemiptera. So they've got a certain site where they're going after, and they access the fluids of the phloem. Armored scales feed in a substantially different way. They do not feed in the vascular system of the plant. Instead, they feed on individual cell contents. So uh, often these are in the cambium area of the plant if they're on bark. And so individual cells, they might be, say, the palisade parenchyma cells, the spongy parenchyma, uh, rarely the epidermis, but they will be feeding on individual cells and often killing those cells. So kind of the way I kind of imagine these is think of their mouth parts working more like a slant drill, goes in and then penetrates more or less horizontally, evacuating cell contents of cells as they are entered and fed upon. And this will result in cells dying. These will kill cells usually. So feeding on cell contents and cells are killed. That doesn't occur with the soft scales. The other thing that is different is that since armored scales are not feeding in the phloem fluids, they do not excrete honeydew. Honeydew is something you will see with the soft scales only. In terms of reproduction, are males produced? Sometimes they are, and in some cases they're not. Most soft scales produce males. Some may produce males or not. Armored scales, many of them don't produce males. Uh, if they do, a male scale will be much smaller than the female, often have a different form. So in this case, with these armored scales on juniper, the round forms are females, the more elongate forms are males. Uh, in this case, with uh, European elm scale, the cocoons that are indicated here, those are what will produce a male. And the male of many scales will be a tiny winged insect. Very obscure, rarely observed, doesn't look like much of anything else, but they may have males, they may not. If they don't, then it will be asexual reproduction. The case indicated here with the European elm scale, sometimes they have males and sometimes they don't. So let's, in this first section, just focus on armored scales, and then we'll pick up soft scales next. Armored scales, one family, and a couple of examples of these. These may be less important elsewhere, but these are local examples. Oyster shell scale is arguably the most important single scale insect we have in this part of the country. It develops on the bark, the limbs, and the trunk of a wide variety of commonly planted woody plants: lilac, cotoneaster, willows, poplars, aspen. Often we see it on aspen around here. It gets its name because it has a oyster shell's appearance. The cover kind of looks like an oyster shell. And being an armored scale, they're not moving, and so they can sometimes build up very high populations and not be normally observed. It might just look like little bumps on the bark to a casual passerby. But they can build up very high densities. And in this case, we have a trunk of an aspen, and I've scraped the scale off to show that it was essentially a solid mass. In this case, in this case, also the tree died from this infestation. But again, they're not very visible. They kind of blend in often with the bark, and on some kinds of plants, notably ash or lilac, they can blend in very well, even more so than the illustration I have here. On some plants, they may also cause differences in growth form. Again, aspen, a common plant around here, and regularly affected by oyster shell scale. Even if we were to control it, they do damage while they're on the plant that is irreversible. So on the smooth bark of an aspen, if it's been infected with oyster shell scale at some point, those areas, because of the cell damage that has been done by these scales feeding on the cells of the bark, will always look different. So you'll see a rougher bark. In this case, the scales have been controlled, but we're still seeing the bark many years later looking quite irregular due to the damage that had been done earlier. The typical stage that many armored scales overwinter, and in this case with oyster shell scale would be an example, are eggs. So in the wintertime, were you to flip over a scale that had been produced the previous year, you could see that there are eggs. The eggs are in the left of the picture here. The rest of what you're seeing is a covering on the underside of the scale. Uh, Imagine the scale itself being that elongate insect. It's now dead. The female would be kind of a little shriveled remnant on the pointed end of the scale, and then the rest would be eggs, completely enclosed with the hard outer part or hard cover on the back, and then this little thinner layer that is protecting them on the underside. So on the left, upper left, we see a scale that's been turned over again with eggs. And then when eggs of scales hatch, we have a very important stage. The first stage, nymphs, we call crawlers. And this is a very important stage for many purposes. For all scales, it is the most mobile period. It is the time when they are most likely to move about and find different parts of the plant, or if they're carried in the wind or on the legs of birds or some other animal, they may move to another plant. And it is the only mobile stage of the oyster shell scale and all other armored scales. After this brief period when they're crawlers, they either settle or they are dead within a week or 10 days or so. So in this picture, the upper left, I think you can see the large covers of the uh, mother scales, and the eggs were underneath there. The eggs have hatched, and most of what's the picture in the upper left are recently settled crawlers. So they have settled, they've got their mouth parts in place, they've molted, and they are not going to move from this point on. Any ones that successfully develop to the adult form will be as big as the mother, and obviously not all of them could survive in this case. Another picture on the lower left shows a mother scale cover, as well as many that have many recently settled crawlers around her that originated from eggs that hatched from the mother or other mothers on this plant. Another kind of scale that is quite widespread in North America is pine needle scale, and this is an insect that develops on needles of conifers. In most places, it's pines. In this area of the country, it's mostly on spruce. So it's got that elongate body form, but they're a pale color, a white color, and so they're pretty obvious. So these again are on the needles. Picture in the upper left, got two of them together on a needle. And then on the lower right, we see what the scale insect itself looks like when you have flipped the cover over. So that's the scale insect. When they're going to be producing eggs, the pine needle scale starts to turn a little more pinkish and pink brown color, and then she produces eggs. And a typical amount of eggs might be about a dozen, maybe 15. In this case, we see one that's doing quite well. So producing 2-3 dozen eggs, which is well above average for an armored scale, which typically lay between 10 and 20 eggs. Again, another photo series of pine needle scales, and some on the left, excuse me, on the right, you can see have been flipped over, and you can see the eggs that were underneath them. Eggs hatch, you get crawlers. The crawlers are the same color of the egg. They walk around for a week or 10 days. And this is an insect that in many cases is fairly predictable on when crawlers are going to occur, in that it occurs about the same time common lilac is in full bloom. That's what we call a phenological indicator, a natural event that tends to be associated with an insect event we're concerned with. The settled crawlers remain in place after they have shed their skin for that first time and molted and lost their legs. So again, crawler for less than a week, they molt, and then they remain in place for the rest of their life. And so we see mostly settled crawlers here on pine needles. So crawlers still there, and various stage nymphs of the pine needle scale in this photo. And ultimately, they become an adult. In some populations, there's 2 generations a year. In some areas, there's males. Here in the Rocky Mountain West, we have a 1 generation, 1 parent strain of the pine needle scale. But elsewhere, it could be different. There are numerous natural enemies that attack scales. And in this case, just talking about ones that are attacking the scale. But most armored scales have 1 or more kinds of lady beetles that attack them, the kind of predators. Lady beetles that are most important on scale control are usually specialists of scale insects. So this is a tiny little black beetle that happens to be an excellent predator of pine needle scale. There are there are other lady beetles that specialize in armor scales as well. So these might chew through the body cover of the scale and then feed on the developing insect underneath the scale cover or the eggs that have been produced. So you might see a little chewed mark there. And then there are various parasitoid wasps that attack scales. And we see one on the left, we see one on the right, different species. These were underneath the cover of the scale. There's also some settled scales on the picture on the lower right as well. But if you see a scale that has a smooth round hole, that would be one through which a parasitoid wasp has emerged. Some other examples of armored scales might be obscure scale on oak, a good name because it blends in very well with the bark and is fairly hard to see. But in the Midwest, this can be a fairly common kind of scale on oaks. One that's a little unusual in that it has a lot of development on leaves as well as stems would be on euonymus, the euonymus scale. Very dramatically different female and male forms. The females are the brown form, look very much like an oyster shell scale. The white are the covers produced by males in this species. And a species that has had very serious impact on a plant, an introduced insect, the cycad Alocaspis scale attacks cycads in Florida and has been devastating. Although some biocontrols have been introduced that may help suppress this and reduce its attack. So those are examples of some armored scales. And next, we'll talk about soft scales and how to manage scales.